Hey, everybody. Um, Thank you for joining us for the second of our 101 series put on by the Green Socialist Education Project's the Green Socialist Organizing Project's Education Working Group. My name is Chris Blankenhorn. I'm a former GPUS co-chair, secretary of the Illinois Green Party, and I help organize the Education Working Group with the Green Socialist Organizing Project. With me is Garrett, and I'll let him do his thing.
Yeah, hi, I'm Garrett Wasserman. I'm a current GPUS co-chair and member here in the Green Party of Pennsylvania. I live near Pittsburgh.
Awesome. So today, like I said, we're going to be doing Ecosocialism 101. This is a part of a recurring series that we're going to do once a month. Last month, we did our first one with Green Party 101. You can find the recording and the slideshow at greensocialist.net/101s. After this one is done, same thing by tomorrow, you'll probably see the recording and the slideshow uploaded there. Next month, we're going to be doing Organizing 101. So we're the Green Socialist Organizing Project, and we did Green Party, Socialism, and Organizing. It's directly out of our name. These first 3 months, we're doing them on Zoom, or not Zoom, we're doing them via live stream. It's a little more one-directional, but we will take questions as we go, and especially at the end. And then in April, May, and June, we will probably do the follow-up version when we will repeat Green Party, Socialism, Organizing, and we'll probably do that on Zoom to have more of a two-way discussion. We're just trying to figure out how to best do these, so we're trying a lot of mediums as we cycle. So with that, we will get started, and let me add this up there, and we're good to go.
Here's the slides.
I'll hand it off to you, Garrett.
Oh, great, yeah.
I will interject in inappropriate times.
Sounds good. Yeah, so let's get started, and welcome again, everybody, to the live stream here. This is our Socialism 101, or perhaps Ecosocialism 101, or maybe Green Socialism 101, whatever. Pick your favorite term here. We'll go through the basics of just what socialism means in kind of a general sense, because of course it's a deep rabbit hole that you can study a lot. But we'll go through the basics here, and in particular talk about what it means to have a green form of socialism in the modern era, and what that means for our organizing, what that means for our pathway forward to create a better society that meets the key values and the vision of the future and all that we had talked about in the previous stream for Green Party 101. So kind of along those lines, there's a short little outline of what we'll talk about. It's really difficult to talk about what socialism is without first describing what currently exists. We're trying to create socialism, and right now we don't have socialism. Right now we live under a form of capitalism, and that's its own kind of buzzword that can get emotionally charged and all. And there's not always complete agreement on what we mean by capitalism. So we're going to talk about at least one definition or one way to look at it to try to help kind of center our conversation. And then we'll talk about, once we have kind of a basis for capitalism, we'll talk about what socialism is. We'll talk about a history of socialism globally, as well as a little bit in the US. And then, of course, end with modern green socialism and where we go next, which the spoiler is you go to Organizing 101 next month and you learn how to get involved. All right, so first we'll start with what is capitalism. A lot of people will probably kind of gut reaction say it has to do with the economy. It has to do with jobs and the economy and how things are produced and traded and all this stuff. And that is certainly in the right direction. But capitalism is, at this point, in history, not only an economic system, but really it's a whole encompassing thing around our society and culture, in addition to economics, that essentially dominates our whole sense of society and politics at this point. It's become so pervasive in everything we discuss that it's not really just an economic system anymore. There's a lot of different ways to analyze it, but a nice short essay that comes from Social Ecology, which we touched on in our Green Party 101 thing last month, is an essay called "What is Capitalism?", which identifies 4 characteristics of the entire capitalist system. Again, not just the economy, but how it impacts society and culture as a whole. And these 4 basic characteristics are, first, commodity production. And what that means is that items become commoditized. I have a hard time saying that. It's kind of a complicated word. But they become commodities, which means that their main goal, their main purpose is for being sold, for being traded on the market. So something like, you can have a cell phone, for example. Cell phone does lots of really cool stuff. It allows you to call people, text people, do all kinds of things, right? But to a capitalist mindset, all of that stuff is kind of secondary. The main point of making a cell phone is because I can put it on the market and sell it and make profit. And that's what we're talking about with commodities. It's this profit first motive, instead of asking who needs it, what is it used for, and making sure that's allocated to the right place. The second characteristic is markets. You can't have commodities without markets, in a sense, right? That it's all about making profits and selling them on these markets, which are exchanges of goods or money and things like that. And markets can exist outside of capitalism, but again, under capitalism, the market has so dominated our culture and society that we view everything as market transactions. When we, even when we talk as humans, like between each other, we start talking about signing contracts with each other and things, all these very market-focused terms, instead of just kind of behaving as humans. So that kind of infiltrates our concepts. We'll come back to that. A third characteristic is the existence of property as investment. So some people will just call this private property, but that can get a little bit confusing, because we're not talking about like your toothbrush that you own or something, right? Some little thing that you're using for yourself. That's not private property in this sense. Like, yes, it's yours. That's personal property. It's this. What we're talking about here is different. We're talking about somebody owns something to do with the economy in particular, like a factory or resources or something, and they say, I own it because I have this piece of paper. I own it because I say that I own it, and it doesn't belong to the community or the workers or anything like that. It belongs to some capitalist investor. So that makes it different from personal property. And then finally, there's exploited labor. You could also say like wage labor, for example. And it's just that workers essentially don't have any control over what is produced and what is distributed, where all those resources go. Instead, it's those investors, it's those capitalists who are essentially calling the shots and saying, hey, because I own it, this is what we're doing, and you have to do it this way. And just kind of fundamentally, because workers are not allowed to be involved in those decision-making things, they get exploited one way or another. They're not paid fairly for what they're producing, because the capitalism always sucks profits off of it. You're never getting the full benefit of what you're producing, right? So when we talk about capitalism, we're talking about these 4 characteristics and how they interact with each other. Like, it's not even just them by themselves, but how they interact with each other to create this whole society that we see in front of us. So I think Chris has some more comments about that. So
yeah, I mean, and kind of what with the interconnection, it's like our labor is commoditized.
Yes,
right? Labor, the workers in and of themselves, the fact that someone has to do the work is a commodity to the capitalist. It's just another part of the equation, like materials and rent and utility bills and that kind of thing. But I think it's, we're starting off our 101 with, characteristics of capitalism. And it's where we need to start when we have these conversations on the ground too, right? Ask your average person what capitalism is, and you will get nothing that comes anywhere near describing a socioeconomic system, right? Nothing that comes near describing a political system, nothing that comes anywhere near describing something that has the totality that we are dealing with modern capitalism. So it's really important to start there, right? Because if you're going to start talking to somebody about socialism and they don't understand what capitalism is, what socialism is, the basis of these terms, it's going to be a really hard conversation, right? So we really cover in these kind of, when you're talking to the general public, when you're advocating for socialism, we've got to start with this 101 absolute basic level stuff, right? Before we got on, I told Garrett a story about when I was in school, and I had an advocate, a capitalist proponent coming at me on social media, and I asked them to define capitalism. And they basically said, it's a system where everyone has opportunity. That's not a definition. And this was someone in a political science program, right? That understands what political definitions mean and what theory means and how these things work. But when asked to defend the system that they advocated for, they couldn't even come close to putting a reasonable definition out. They just threw out myth. They threw out propaganda, right? And that's something we have to deal with, is that most people have a complete lack of understanding of what capitalism actually is, what socialism actually is. So we've really got to start, right here with the basics. And every time it snows, right, you see socialist snowplow memes, and then someone goes off and calls the military and cops socialism, and then we're just completely out of words meaning things, right? But this is what we have to deal with, right? Even people I know who think of themselves as self-proclaimed socialists often fall into this trap of thinking of social programs, which are moderations within capitalism, as socialism, right? And even things like unions in their context within the capitalist system are moderations of capitalism. They aren't, especially when we're talking about the big corporate unions. We're not talking about worker ownership and that kind of thing, which is really what it comes down to. Democratic control of the means of production. So,
yeah, definitely. So, Chris hit on some interesting points here about, the myths around capitalism, and that's what we have to talk about next before we can really get at what we're going for in terms of socialism. So, but try to keep these characteristics in mind when you're thinking about it, that, underneath capitalism, again, there's that commodity production. There's the focus on, is this something I could sell to make profit, as opposed to, is it useful to society, for example? And the role of markets and market interactions in society, property rights over how things are produced, and treating labor as a commodity and exploiting it. These are important characteristics as we move forward. So speaking of those myths, capitalism has we've all lived under capitalism. We still live under capitalism, and we acutely experience and feel the problems of capitalism. And it manifests through those characteristics where, because everything is commoditized and owned by investors, we see that we end up not having these human economic rights that are so important just for living every day. We don't have a right to housing. Instead, investors and landlords own the housing, and they decide whether or not you have a place to sleep tonight. And we see the result of that, of course, is evictions. We don't have a right to food. We don't have a right to medicine. We don't have a right to water. We don't have a right to peace, because capitalism, in order to expand markets and to find new places to sell things and all, will get stuck in these imperial wars so that they can get more resources, find more markets, all this stuff, right? So we end up not really having the necessary rights to live a good life. We don't get our housing, our food, our medicine, our water, and our peace, because the things we talked about before, private investment, private profit, being able to sell things and commodities, those are always put first over our human needs. And, it's a direct result of those characteristics of capitalism that these issues are put over human needs.
Yeah, and I mean, sorry.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
And just looking at, something like rent, right? When you're paying rent, you're covering all costs needed to deal with that house. You're covering the mortgage, you're covering the taxes, you're covering expected repairs, and you're covering profit, right? So when when we look at what happens with this commodification, it takes something that's a life essential, right? Shelter, and it takes it, and when you get that private investment or that private ownership for profit in there, now you see the working class, not only paying for what's needed to live in and upkeep the house, but paying for someone else's lifestyle as well. So, and you can go through all of this, right? And I think I had this discussion on Twitter the other day about, why it's important to understand the differences between a capitalist, even a progressive capitalist, goals and organizing work versus socialist, goals and organizing work. When you look at even the things the progressive Democrats are putting out in regards to housing, in regards to healthcare, in regards to a lot of or their complete silence on imperialism for the most part. When you look at what they're putting out, it's all going back into private hands, right? How do we deal with the housing crisis? We pay landlords to do, to keep their rent low, or we pass rent control. How do we address the climate change? We pay companies to be better, right? Whereas socialists tend to have public as the public programs as the center, publicly and democratically controlled programs at the center. How do we provide housing? With public housing, right? How do we provide for food? Through job guarantees and through access to social programs and things like that. Healthcare, even the progressive Dems, and they might want to get rid of, I almost said there. They might want to provide a public option. I think they'll cave and allow it to just be a public option. I don't think they're going to get rid of private insurance altogether. I don't think that's something they're organizing for. But we need to deal with the whole sector, right? If we pass Medicare for all, it's going to become it's going to become a feeding trough for big pharma, for providers, for medical manufacturers, right? These things that are life and death, that are basic necessities, have to be ran for public good and not for, private profits, which is, what this slide is getting at. That the core problem, one of the core problems with capitalism is that the society and the economy, and as we talked about it earlier, the totality of it all at this point, and how it's all interconnected, it's all oriented towards profit and away from human need.
Yep, exactly. So all of these characteristics and problems kind of move into another concept that'll kind of come up later. I'll just mention it. There's a lot of text here. You could read the book that's listed if you want. It's actually a pretty good book that talks about all of the problems and how capitalism is intertwined with something that we call the state, which is this political, socio-cultural, economic entity. It's kind of an abstract thing that we all kind of uphold by participating in it, by living in it. However, once it's established, it wants totality over everything. Everything has to go through the state, in the sense of everything has to be legal. You got to have your contracts and permissions and things like that. And through various regulatory means, the state essentially upholds capitalism, and you find that there's a very strong connection between the two, and exactly what that is up for some debate that we'll talk about. But there's a very strong connection between the two, where you see a lot of play with the state, which you can kind of think about as government. They're a little bit different, but government and capitalism go together, right? All of our politicians make it very clear when they take money from corporations and all, like who they're listening to, right? They're listening to the capitalist investors. They're not listening to labor and workers and the rest of us. So I don't want to get too far into that because there's more to say later. I think the main point of this slide, though, is that those characteristics of capitalism and those problems and all, through the state, through government, become systematized. They become structured. They become an institutionalized. There you go. That's the good word. And once they've become institutionalized, it makes it much harder to change, because now you kind of have this resistance of, well, that's the way things always worked. Why would you want to change that? And and they can use forces and power against you if you want to change those things. So what we're really looking at is a structural problem now built around these characteristics, and it's out of the hands of individuals anymore. It's a structural, society-wide problem. And so because of that leads to some myths that are very common among especially leftists and socialists and all, especially in the US, some myths about how capitalism works. And so there's a great essay, 7 Left Myths About Capitalism by Blair Taylor, that talks about these misconceptions that come up so much whenever you read articles online from many different sources, from progressives and leftist type people, use that term. They will make a lot of these statements that actually end up being myths about the system. And my summary of them would be that they tend to focus on individuals as opposed to looking at the big, broad, systemic picture. So, for example, here, a very common thing is to say it's greed, right? If we could get greed out of the process, that would fix everything. Not really, because capitalism has this kind of grow or die imperative, where because of the way markets work and things like that, businesses naturally have to compete with each other, and they have to do more and more and more, or otherwise they get hostily taken over or defeated by other businesses. And it gets out of the hands of an individual anymore. It gets out of the hands of the CEO. It becomes an imperative to survive under capitalism that you have to always have more and more and more. It's not individual greed at this point, or at least not broadly. Not saying the greed doesn't exist, obviously, but saying that the system as a whole is not caused by greed by itself. It's a systemic problem. And this also applies to corruption. Yes, corruption exists, but that's not the primary problem with politicians. And this kind of gets at the heart of why supporting, say, for example, someone to run as a Democrat, a progressive to run as a Democrat, isn't going to change the system very deeply, because it's not a matter of corruption and picking a new person and then, hey, once we have a new person in office, it fixes it. No, that doesn't change the systemic structure of capitalism around that office. That puts immense pressure on you once you're in office to uphold the system, to either uphold the system or you get kicked out very quickly, right? It turns against you. And similar happens with Wall Street. Some people focus on financial monetary things. But again, that's the root cause there is exploitation of labor. It's not really about the monetary system, again, as a primary thing. Some people will look at big corporations and they'll say, break them up, right? They'll say, break them up, make smaller things. Small corporations are still capitalist, though, and they still have that same drive to exploit workers and to grow or die, right? To continue growing, to take over competitors and do all that stuff. So even by focusing on small business instead of big, you're not fixing it, And unfortunately, what happens is folks will also turn to conspiracy, where they'll think, there's some small group in the back. You hear things like deep state, right? There's some small group that's making decisions and causing all this. And again, it's a systemic wide problem. It's not individuals or some small group of people on the whole that are making capitalism this way. It's a systemic, societal, cultural wide thing that we have to talk about. And we all have to work together toward changing. And we have to be careful how we talk about it. That if we just talk about, for example, take America back, build back better, right? Make America great again. These things are kind of hiding the systemic nature in the history of capitalism in this country. That's especially intertwined with, racism and colonialism and all these things. I think the big picture here is just that there is a big picture that when we talk about capitalism, it's systemic, and it's not just replacing any particular individual that's going to be enough to change it. It has to be a systemic change, which means a change in how the institutions themselves work. And primarily that means shifting things toward democracy, toward including more workers and communities in decision making, instead of having it allocated to capitalist investors and a small group of elected officials and things like that propagate this. So
yeah, and I think too, the essay is called 7 Left Myths About Capitalism, but these apply to the center, the Democratic center and center right too. It's a common thing that you see qualifiers added to capitalism to try to save it. Right? This is crony capitalism. This is corporate capitalism.
Yep, exactly.
This is capitalism, and this is exactly as it is designed. Right? This is how the system is supposed to work. And I think too, there's when it comes to this, and I'm really glad that Garrett brought this into brought into the conversation the idea of a systemic versus individuals. Because that was what I was mainly going to jump in with. And there are psychological reasons why we do this stuff, right? If there's a person that's the problem, there's a tangible thing that can be done. They can be voted out of office, right? But if it's systemic, the solutions are so much bigger. The situation is so much more precarious, right? And so it's just easier. It's why I think we see so many liberals have a crisis of confidence and become libertarians, right? Because they see the problems with capitalism. And then they find the first ideology that gives them specific things that they can attack, in this case, elected officials in government, right? And so it's really important that we understand that while there are very real and very horrible people, that are responsible for the state of the world that we live in today, it's systemic, right? They are merely pawns in the system, and they may be very, very powerful pawns. They may have benefited a lot, but you get rid of Elon Musk, you get rid of Jeff Bezos, there's another one in the wings. There's somebody else that's going to rise up. There's somebody else that's going to fill that role. So, I think, understanding these myths is good, but really understanding that underlying thing of, this isn't about individual actors. This is about systems of oppression. And when it's really important, projecting out till next month for organizing, that when we organize, we understand that basic fact, or else we're organizing with the wrong targets. We're organizing in the wrong direction. So, over.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, no, you've got it exactly right. And that kind of mention about it seems like such an enormous goal to change the systemic thing, and so it kind of shakes the faith of some people, and they might run to libertarianism or something that might seem easier, or an easier way to handle such a big problem. And that's exactly why we need this leftist, we need the socialist analysis of capitalism, because as it's pointed out, this is a quote from that Myths essay. that was on the previous slide. But the left does not have a monopoly on critiques of capitalism. And given where the left is at right now, there's a great danger of the rise of reactionary forms of anti-capitalism. This is something we have to be very careful about, that lots of people are understanding how capitalism is failing us right now, but they don't necessarily have a socialist vision of democracy and liberation for everyone as their solution. Instead, their solution might be to become more insular and to blame certain groups of people, to become xenophobic or racist or whatever, right? So we have to understand capitalism and critique it, but we also have to be very careful about creating our socialist alternative, our green socialist alternative that is really going to work for everyone, and fight back against that tendency to try to blame others.
Yeah, and the thing that rises into mind here is ecofascism, right? It's kind of the antithesis to what the Green Party is fighting for, right? But we see it. We're seeing it start to develop and really start to rise. This idea of we need to lock down the borders to protect our resources, right? We need to make sure that we don't get migrants don't come here when climate catastrophe happens. Like the use of the climate crisis caused by capitalism, being used as a justification for ecofascism, and it's why we have to develop a strong left and a strong socialist movement and critique of capitalism, because the problems that are coming are, whether it be economic crisis, climate crisis, nuclear war, all of this multimodal crises that we're facing, when they come, if there's no other alternative, the far right's going to get it. They're going to get the people, right? And my perfect example for this is look at the rural communities in America, right? The Democratic Party and the center, the Democratic Party and the left, socialists, have largely completely abandoned rural America. And most people that I know that live in urban areas or that live or have leftist and progressive views have very negative and broad stroke thoughts about rural people. They're all racist, they're all this, they're all that. Well, it's the only option that's been presented to them, right? They're being destroyed by capitalism, just like we are in cities, just like we are around the globe. But the only people talking to them are the right-wing Republicans, and they're riling them up on social issues while they kill them on economic and political issues, right? So, if you want to, it's absolutely essential that we have this, because if we don't, it's over, and the pendulum's swinging really hard the other way.
Yep, definitely. So,
with that, it now. This isn't Nostradamus shit. We're seeing it right now.
Right. It's not hypothetical. We're seeing these far right reactions to everything that's going on right now. Including the pandemic response.
Yeah.
So it's very important to build our green socialist alternative and organize together, so that we can present that alternative to people, so we don't go down that path. So, to that end, we've talked about what capitalism is. We haven't talked too much about socialism yet. So obviously that's the name of this talk. So that is our next goal here. Now that we have some basis on what capitalism is, we can talk about what socialism is in comparison to that. And I do want to note here that socialism is actually a very broad topic, and there's a lot of different tendencies and groups that will call themselves socialists, but they have some differences on exactly what sort of strategy or tactics they might use, for example. And so this, the rest of this talk is not the proper forum to do a detailed analysis on that and to say, this one is better than this one or something like that. That's not the goal here. It's just to give some kind of history and background to the socialist movement through history up to now, so that we can kind of understand where we're coming from and what we're facing today, so that it can help inform what we need to do to organize for the future. So let's start with one of my favorite folks, Eugene Debs, in American history, who was a big deal with the Socialist Party, was the Socialist Party presidential candidate for, I think, 5 different elections in the early 1900s, and was a really big figure in American socialism and labor and worker organizing. He said that socialism is a theory of society in which the workers are to own the social means of production, and in which the workers will use them not to produce multimillionaires, I guess today we would say billionaires, but to fill the land with wealth so that poverty such as we now understand it may be abolished. And I think this is a really good short way to think about socialism, that we're talking about workers owning the means of production, which means having a democratic say in how things are done. So think back to those capitalist characteristics, right? We want workers to not be exploited, but to instead work together to produce things for human needs, and specifically to abolish poverty, right? To make sure that everyone has their human needs met for the food and water and shelter and medicine, all we were talking about. That is not being handled under capitalism. So, general characteristics of socialism, you can kind of invert what we were talking about under capitalism, right? That instead of production for sale, for profits, it's production to meet human needs. And in particular, for an eco-socialist variant, we want to make sure that that production respects natural limits, right? That we're doing things in a sustainable way. We want to make sure that, instead of workers not having any say in the process, that we have democracy in the workplace, that the workers themselves help make decisions around production administration to make sure that we're doing it the right way for the right purpose. We want our communities to have more of a direct say in how the economy works, instead of random markets with, people running around and throwing money at each other and things like that. We want our communities to actually have participation in that process, to decide what does the economy look like for our town and our region, and how is that economy going to meet our needs. So a couple of related terms to this are a moral economy as opposed to a market economy, one that's moral, that's good and to take care of people, right, to make sure that they get what they need. Another good term is the cooperative commonwealth, where we're imagining where communities and workers are all working together cooperatively to make sure that everyone is taken care of, that everyone has a say in things and gets what they need. And then finally, instead of this reliance on private property, and remember that definition we gave, we have a much greater idea of what we call the commons, that things are owned publicly and communally, and that we have some sort of democratic system in order to decide how to use those resources for our common good. And there's a lot of detail that goes into it, but that's, I think, some basic characteristics of where we're going for socialism. So again, the ultimate goal is to end that exploitation, and to give freedom and democracy to everyone, and to make sure that everyone has their needs met. And if for some reason we're not, we get together and we talk about it and we figure out how to fix that, right? Things won't necessarily be perfect all the time, right? But as challenges come up, we meet them together democratically as a society. All right. There's a longer quote here from the IWW, but maybe in time interest, I'll kind of skip past it. But the IWW has kind of a longer quote that kind of expands on what Debs was saying, which Debs was one of the members of. But it, basically saying that there could be no peace as long as there's hunger, right? We have to struggle together against capitalism to create the kind of society that we want to live in, that makes sure that everyone is taken care of, that lives in harmony with the earth. You see, it's this goes back there, right? People were beginning to think of ecological things. And one thing that's kind of striking is this idea at the very end of this quote of forming the structure of the new society within the shell of the old. And so that's something we'll kind of come back to the rest of our history lesson here.
Yeah, and I think it's important, Garrett mentioned kind of offhand that they're talking about the same things we're talking about now. And that's really, important to understand, especially understanding socialism and Marxism, as a process, which we'll get into later, and not as a moment in history or a finite thing. And it makes me think of, I was heavily involved in the Occupy movement, and at the time, my now wife worked at the Lincoln Presidential Library in Springfield, Illinois, when we lived, and she had access to all of their archives, which were the Illinois State Historical Society archives. That means leftist papers from the 1800s, things like that. And, Albert Parsons, the Alarm, and he was one of the Haymarket Martyrs. He was the big name in the Haymarket Martyrs, that they have hit the full run of his Alarm, right? And it goes up, it starts and it goes for a few years, and then there's the day they called the meeting at the Haymarket, and that morning, the meeting tonight at Haymarket Square, and then it goes blank for months because there was the bombing happened and the massacre happened, and so they got shut down. But so in the course of her digging through all of this stuff, she found a poem from the 1800s called The 90 and the 9, 99%. And we actually had a member of our student group, the Radical Student Union, read it at an Occupy rally. And we talked about, over a century ago, they were talking about the same exact issues. They were talking about them using the same language, right? And obviously, capitalism has ramped up. Things are different. What those issues are and how they manifest in our lives materially is completely different. But the underlying systemic structure was there. It's why you can read Marx today, and it seems like he's critiquing the society we live in, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of parallels today, I think, with the time that Eugene Debs lived in, and the Gilded Age, and all of the labor organizing that was occurring at the time, and the problems that were happening under capitalism. We're seeing those same sort of effects happen again. And having a good socialist analysis of history is what allows us to understand why have things not changed so much, or maybe more specifically, there's this kind of idea of kind of a golden era in U.S. history, right? Right after World War II, where everything was just like amazing. We had the New Deal, and the middle class was growing, and everyone was rich and prosperous and all. And it obviously something was wrong with that, because that condition, if it existed, and there's a lot that goes into that, but but clearly that condition has not lasted to today, if nothing else, right? Because none of us are experiencing what they talk about. We're dealing with evictions during a pandemic, and lack of food and medicine and all these things. And
it's important to understand, when you talk about the New Deal and things like that, it's important to understand that it saved capitalism.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
We saw Russia fall and the Bolsheviks come to power, in the early 1900s. You've got socialist revolutions going on around the world, and FDR saved capitalism by creating state, programs that would buffer against some of its worst effects. And going back to whether it existed or not, he then selectively applied them. Mm-hmm. Right? So if you weren't already on the verge of the middle class and white, you weren't benefiting from these programs like others, right? And that goes for things like the GI Bill and stuff too. But it's important to understand these watershed moments in these big context of what actually happened was FDR saved capitalism and really kicked off a expansion of capitalism to this global scale, and this cultural scale that might not have existed prior to World War II, which required that globalization to develop.
Yeah,
World War II was really, really important in terms of how and why capitalism was able to just go nuts right after, right?
Right.
How all of a sudden America is just completely dominant globally within a few decades, economically and militarily, and all of it. World War II and the kind of the demands that global war put on how we produced things set it up perfectly for where we are now.
Yeah, exactly. So I may have jumped ahead a little bit there because some more history coming up, but
It's hard. This whole time I'm like, oh, and here's where we can talk about Gramsci, and here's where we can talk about De Boer.
I know there's always so much. So trying to condense an introduction, and then when we do it again in future, we can talk more details. But
I managed to talk about culture without bringing up Adorno and Horkheimer. So,
oh gee. So anyway, yeah, I guess the last thing I want to mention before we move on real quick here is again, notice in this statement that it's talking about the workers having democracy, having their needs met, living in harmony with the earth, and these are all systemic changes again. Notice that they're not calling for I want the president to resign or something like that, right? It's not focused on individuals, it's focused on changing the entire system. So one common question is like, can we even do that? Is that even possible? And there's of course a lot that goes into that. I'm not going to be able to talk about that in like 2 minutes on the slide, but a couple of things to think about at least are, for one thing, through 99% of human history, that humans as we know it, Homo sapiens, have existed. We did not live under capitalism. Capitalism is a completely new thing, a completely new type of domination in society and all that has only existed for the last few hundred years. And so, it started, but it means that we can live without it because our ancestors did. We can find ways around it. We can create a new type of society. And one book I like a lot, for example, is this book Mutual Aid, which talks about kind of evolutionary pressures about what pushes evolution in nature, that different species will evolve. And kind of this right-wing concept is they focus on competition, and they say evolution is driven by competition. It's all about like beating each other and hurting each other and all this stuff. And that's not actually true. When you not to say that competition never exists, but when you look at the science behind evolution, what actually drives especially complex, thoughtful life forms like humans is actually a lot of mutualism and cooperation and helping each other and working together. Humans survive better when we work together. We don't survive when we fight each other. So that's another thing.
We wouldn't have gotten to the point where we could even be in large enough societies to fight each other had we not been collective, right?
Exactly.
The proto-humans, the earliest humans, the only way they could survive in an extraordinarily dangerous world in which they were not strong or fast. All they were was smart, and they could stand upright. The only thing that allowed them to survive and become, for better or worse, the apex species on the planet was cooperation. We never would have gotten to the point of competing because we would have lost the competition with predators. We would have lost the competition probably even with other hominids that were stronger, that were faster, but in the long run, because we formed societies, right? We formed our tribes, we formed our villages, we grew and expanded all through, cooperation. And certainly their hierarchy gets in there and exploitation gets in there and all of that. But without cooperation, without the creation of society, which is cooperation kind of penultimately, without that, there's no room for competition because we aren't at a point where we're able to compete against each other because we're competing against the rest of the world. As opposed to now dominating it. Like I said, better or worse, it's what's happened.
Yeah. So, it's essentially built into our genes to cooperate with each other. And we feel that every day when you meet your neighbors, you trade things with them and you help them out and things like that. And maybe not all, okay, maybe some of them annoy you or something like that. But generally speaking, we all have this drive to help each other.
And the same reaction, people that espouse this reactionary idea that competition is central to human civilization, almost universally, in my experience, complain about the collapse of the neighborhood and the community.
Right.
I think that we don't know our neighbors anymore is really a core part of what's wrong with society. But then they turn around and out the other side of their mouth talk about how competition, not society, is what's important. Right.
Yeah.
So even the people who, are using this idea of greed and again, or, it goes back to in competition, see that the breakdown of that social, the centralness of social interaction is a major problem in our society that is being amplified and fueled by capitalism. Because the more alienated we are, the more separate we are, the more othered we are with each other, the easier it is to divide us, the easier it is to exploit and oppress us.
Yeah, exactly. So I think in some ways, when we talk about creating a socialist society, what we're talking about is restoring that sense of community and cooperation and being able to work with each other and make sure that everyone is taken care of. And now that compared to 10,000 years ago or whatever, we have so much understanding of science and medicine and all that didn't used to exist. We can take care of people even better, and there's really no reason at all not to be doing that. So it's retooling society for that. So for one thing, it's part of our human nature, I think, loosely using that term, to be very cooperative with each other and to help each other. So we're not talking about something new. This is what humans like to do. However, since capitalism hasn't existed before in history, we're kind of learning as we go how do we rebuild community after it has collapsed under capitalism, as we have been alienated under capitalism. So we also shouldn't expect socialism to be something that it happens on Thursday and then we have socialism. This is going to be an ongoing process for probably a very long time. If it ever ends, it might just be kind of a forever thing that we are always trying to better ourselves. We're always trying to better society. We're always trying to find new ways to improve ourselves and take care of each other. We learn more about medicine, for example, and we have more ideas in the future. So it's important to keep that in mind, too, that when we say that we're supporting a change to a socialist system, it's not going to be like you pass this bill on Thursday and then it happens. This is an ongoing process of building community, trying things, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't work, and working together cooperatively to continually improve.
Yeah, it's it's one of the areas where I am very Marxist, and that I don't believe, and I differ with a lot of old school Greens. I don't believe there's a peace, love, and happiness, utopia at the end of the tunnel. If there's two of us, we're going to have some issues we need to work out, and that's what society is, right? To get to this zero conflict, and conflict is necessary for growth.
Mm-hmm.
To get to this point, this envisioned society where there's just nothing but harmony. That means there's no individualism. That means there's a lot of things that are really important. It's just a homogenous, gestalt society. So I think it's really important that we understand this process. And I think next month we're going to talk a whole lot about things like precarity, right? People want a 100% answer to what things are going to look like. And the truth that we need to be really upfront with is we don't know. We're going to try some things. Some things are going to work. Some things won't. Right. And the same is true. It's when I look at capitalism today, we've got a 100% failure rate for most people. Right. No matter what they do, it's failing people. But people are really tied to what they know. So they will hold on to that 100% failure rate, even if there was something that had a 50% failure rate, because it might fail. And they don't know what that'll look like. So next week, I think, or next month, we'll talk a lot about precarity. We'll talk a lot about, how to organize, and we're talking about neighborhoods. It's like your first door knock should be your neighbor,
Mm-hmm.
and then spread out from there. So,
yeah, definitely things to look forward to. So those are some things to keep in mind. That
it's so hard not to go off into next month.
I know. So, but those are some things to keep in mind.
Organizing orient, to
Mm-hmm.
achieve this, we need to organize. So it's hard to segregate them out and keep saying we'll talk about that next month.
I know what you mean. There's just so much to it, but
we're already an hour in.
yeah. We don't want to get too off track here. We don't want to keep you too long. So, but yeah, right. So these are some things to keep in mind, that a socialist society is possible, and it's up to us to organize for it. So think about it over the next month until Organizing 101 comes out. But in the meantime, some more food for thought is that while we're trying to figure out the best path forward, one of the best ways we can do that is by looking at the successes and failures of history. What have past socialist movements done that was successful and maybe not so successful, and what can we learn from those movements about our green socialist movement today under today's circumstances. So there's one more quote here by Ursula Le Guin, which I always liked it. It's related to all this stuff. We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, but then so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. And that's something that's important to keep in mind, that the system as it exists today, was created by humans. And so, there's nothing magical or, divine or anything about it. It's just a human society. And so we can change that. We can make a different human society. It is within our reach. We just have to organize for it. And again, learn from history to help with our organizing. So very brief outline of socialist thought in history. And this will be kind of our last section as we work our way up to modern green socialism. A lot of modern socialist thought that you'll hear kind of comes from this Eurocentric sort of point of view. And I do want to point out that socialist ideas have existed in many cultures, all the cultures around the world, outside of, Europe. One of the main reasons I think that we want to focus on European history, though, is that Europe is kind of where capitalism was perfected and then spread to the rest of the world. Chris was talking about, after World War II, the United States went crazy and and spread capitalism, particularly the neoliberal form of capitalism, this very international market-centric version of capitalism, spread very quickly across the world. And that kind of grew out of ideas in Europe, and so it's important to also think about what was the resistance to those ideas in Europe, and what can we learn from those movements to inform us today. So kind of the roots of those movements go back to the European Enlightenment, which is coming out of the medieval period and the Dark Ages and all, right, where there was a lot of questions about philosophy, just like understanding ethics, like what does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean to know things, to understand things? There was a lot of interest in science, for example. A lot of astronomy and things started around that time period. But most specifically to what we're talking about here, you had some early philosophers of Kant, Hegel, and Feuerbach. I'm not really good at German pronunciations. Hopefully I was close enough. But they talk about epistemology, which is the type of philosophy about how do we understand things, how do we know things. It's studying knowledge, right? How do we know knowledge? How do we know that what we think is true is actually true? That kind of thing. There's also ethics about living a good life. There's also logic, which is a systemic way, or systemic, a way of thinking in a very kind of rigid sort of way to make sure that you're not missing steps and making incorrect assumptions and deductions based on facts. So there was a lot of effort around these things, and that led to a lot of inquiry about those things, in particular applying those things to human society. What can we understand about people and their interactions with each other based on these ideas? And that led...
During that time, too, from Kant to Hegel to Feuerbach to Marx, you get the transition from ideas to material as well.
Yeah.
Right. So they spent a lot of time talking about how do we think, how do we learn, how do we know, and then you saw the trend of the philosophy coming out of these authors moving with, especially with Marx taking a hard veer in rejection of Kantian and Hegelian idea-oriented stuff into the physical, real world, and how do we take these, it's not even right to call them ideas. How do we take this almost scientific method of that was being figured out by Kant and Hegel, Feuerbach, etc., and apply it to human society?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, the first kind of modern socialists, whatever you want to call them, were these so-called utopian socialists, and they basically were looking at just early discussions of the working class, kind of the first people that started when they looked at human society through this philosophy lens we were talking about. They started to notice problems of the working class and this ruling investor class above them, and they started thinking about, well, how can we make that better? How can we make that more fair and ethical? And Owen, for example, in here owned a factory himself and tried to bring in workers to make more decisions and all in the factory, things like that.
Engels also came from factory owning families.
Yeah, a lot of them early on did, I think.
And it's important, with that, it's kind of important to understand this isn't happening in a vacuum, right? This time period from the 16 to 1700s is when we see, feudalism really starting to be challenged by mercantilism, by the actual emergence of a working class, right? Because under feudalism, you've got peasants, but it's different than a working class if we use it. They are the workers there, but the social structure was markedly different. What the modern understanding of a working class starts to come up here as mercantilism comes in and proto-capitalisms, and then capitalism, all on its own. So these thinkers and their movement, ideologically is happening in response to what's happening, in the world around them.
Yeah, exactly. We're moving from this feudal royalty peasant system based on like tribute and things like that to this business oriented, market oriented sort of society. And so the first people that were not necessarily royalty began to own big parts of the economy, and therefore started hiring workers to do, and we see the beginnings of what we're living under today.
And the beginning of the shift from like business serving state to state serving business.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a big shift. And so as Chris mentioned, we kind of have these early socialist ideas about the working class and all. And what really made it kind of into a formalized thing, I think, was one of the big names, at least, is Karl Marx and what eventually became known as Marxism, where he created his an economic analysis of what capitalism was evolving into at that point, and critiqued it, and basically arrived at the conclusion that capitalism was not sustainable, that it was going to continually push the working class into worse and worse conditions until something had to give, right? Something had to change. And so you can read some of his ideas, of course, in the Communist Manifestos. It's really the manifesto of the Communist Party that existed at the time. He also wrote Capital, which is actually a multi-volume thing. I think he only published the first one, though. I think he died before he finished it. But Capital was kind of the big magnum opus that critiqued capitalism, obviously. And so what his
economic manuscripts before, as the lead up. So even Marx.
Yeah.
And you say at the end, that he's somewhat contradictory. He's formulating, a radical new way of thinking about things, and wrote for a long time. My professor in college, he told almost every class I ever was in with him, he told them, if Marx intimidates you because he was internationally renowned for publishing by 27, Kant didn't publish a thing till his 70s. Right? So, but Marx spent literally his entire life evolving this thing, and he had this kind of rare thing that most philosophers don't necessarily get, where people started taking his ideas and putting them into practice, and he got to see it, sink or swim. Some stuff works, some stuff doesn't. And when that starts to happen, when your theory goes into reality, you're going to start changing. You're going to start evolving. And so this idea of, like we've said, that socialism, Marxism isn't a point in time, an end state or something like that, but a process. It started before Marx, and Marx himself really embodied it as he moved through and developed himself and his theory, and all the contradictions within himself.
Right. Yeah, exactly. This is a really lifelong body of work that evolved over time. One of the key things about it, though, was that his criticism turned toward the state that we had mentioned, that the state was an integral problem with capitalism, and that in order to eventually get rid of capitalism for the benefit of workers in society, you would have to also eventually address the state that was upholding capitalism. And that was a big shift from the more ideal thinkers that Chris was talking about in the previous slide. But of course, as these ideas developed over time, there became some contradictions. So as people took aspects of his work and tried to put it into practice, they also developed different offshoots that sometimes would feud with each other. So that's part of the complex history here. So there's a very completely oversimplified, because there's a lot of details to it. But an oversimplified view of what Marx said about the state and all is that the state reinforces material relative scarcity. So that means making sure that there's scarcity, that folks don't necessarily have access to all the things that they need, right? And by doing so, that benefits the ruling class, because then people that need things have to get them from you. They have to buy it from you or whatever, because you can't just find it wherever you want, right? You've got to get it from the source. There's only a small amount of it, or relatively small. And capitalism grew out of those old feudal systems and all to become a type of society that manages the affairs of the owning class, of this ruling class. And in particular, that the highest form of that type of state is the democratic republic that we live in today. That is the kind of the pinnacle that allows the wealthy to still essentially control the state and the economy, but kind of do it a little bit more from the shadows, so that they're not kind of directly exposed to danger, sort of thing, right? So that's kind of what we're up against. And so the state and capitalism are always compelled to continually grow wealth, and the only way they could do that is by taking wealth from the workers. And so eventually the workers have to respond to that, right? And create their own worker state, as he called it, that would dismantle capitalism and eventually create, a socialist type of society over time.
They hadn't figured out MMT yet.
Right. So, like I said, this is extremely oversimplified. I'm sure there's going to be people that jump in and say, "Oh, you didn't mention this or you didn't mention that." I'm not trying to have a comprehensive thing. Just some basic terminology here, so that you know what we're talking about for folks that are honestly new to it.
Well, and even this idea of ecosocialism is a relatively new idea. I mean, in decades new, as opposed to centuries, right? But Kohei Saito wrote Karl Marx's Ecosocialism, right? And so he was Marx started to see the climate aspects and these larger things as it evolved.
Yeah, some people did. So that there's an interesting history there. So in any case, that's what we're talking about here. When we say kind of a Marxist analysis, it's essentially this outline, and there's more details to it, but it's capitalism and the ruling class versus the working class. We had mentioned that there was kind of a different take on those early philosophers and all early on. And so what split off relatively early from the Marx analysis is what's now known as anarchism. Unfortunately, a lot of people misunderstand the term anarchism. Through propaganda, a lot of people think that it means chaos and no rules and this sort of thing. It really just means no rulers. It's like a monarchy. Mono is the word for one, right? It's one ruler. Anarchy is no ruler. So it's not that there's no rules or chaos. It's that we don't have one person in charge who's like the king or whatever, or a group of people or whatever. We don't have that group that says we decide things collectively. That's what anarchism is getting at. So it is a form of socialism, but it's a little bit different from the Marxist-derived ones. Some of the early names involved in that is Proudhon, forgive my French, and Bakunin.
I had to go get my Mikhail, who's named after Bakunin.
There you go.
Got an eagle sleeping on the floor over there too.
Oh, nice! I didn't realize that was their names. That's funny. So you also had this anarchist form of socialism, and they kind of disagreed with Marx a little bit on these three basic points. While they both admitted that there's a class struggle between the working class and the ruling class, there was kind of a disagreement on exactly how to organize and mobilize the working classes and what that entails. There's an argument over organizational form. Marx largely advocated this centralized party structure to advocate for the needs of the working class, whereas anarchists were concerned about that central structure accidentally creating, more rulers or whatever, and so they tended to push for more decentralized forms of organization. And then lastly, there's the question of the state itself, whereas Marx talks about a transitional workers' state. Again, anarchists are concerned about any type of state potentially leading back toward accidentally supporting capitalism reforming. And so they tended to be resistant to the idea of having a worker state and just kind of cutting out the state entirely, right? Just moving kind of straight into a socialist type of society. And there's disagreements there on the role of doing political party politics and participating in elections with your centralized party versus this more decentralized movement building approach. And so
I think it's important too, I think, when talking about, the anarchist side, especially with the modern, misinformation and propaganda that's out there. Marxism is, outside of the left, almost universally discussed as a inherently authoritarian, all state power thing. But if you read Marx, he and the anarchists actually have the same kind of end goal. They disagree on things like is said here, the idea of whether or not a transitional state is necessary or not, right? Whether a party to advocate for yourself as you build up to that transition is necessary or not, and then after the transition to defend your gains. But when you read Marx, he's incredibly misinterpreted, right, or misrepresented, in that full Marxism, full communism gets to this classless, stateless society. It's the goal. The difference of opinion is just on the tactics to get there. And then the other thing I wanted to say on this slide, because I can't not take the shot.
Go for it.
You've got Proudhon on here, and you have him as identified as mutualists, but he's also the person who coined the term libertarian. And anytime I meet an American libertarian, I love to ask them, "Oh, cool, so you like Proudhon?" And they almost never know who he is. And so I tell them, you should really read his essay, What is Property?
Yes.
Because at the end of What is Property, he declares property to be theft. That private property in the capitalist sense, not your toothbrush, but owning 3 houses on your street to rent, is theft, right? And I use it time and time again to lay out the point that American libertarians are making shit up to the point that they don't even know that the words they're using mean. They don't understand the history behind the words, and they don't care to, right? They reinvented and stole the word. And there actually is a movement. It's more popular in Europe, but even in the United States, to reclaim libertarian socialism as a label. I don't personally engage in that, and I think it confuses people. But like, there's a libertarian socialist caucus of the Libertarian Party, and my understanding is their whole purpose is to cause trouble based on the fact that the libertarians don't know what the word libertarian means, right? But yeah, no, Proudhon is one of my favorite, bullets when it comes to getting at libertarians.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up. In kind of an earlier draft of this, I had thought about bringing that up, which is partly why his name is there. That libertarian is, and actually my understanding is that outside of the U.S. and most of the rest of the world, even today, libertarian still is synonymous with more of a socialist anarchist point of view. It's only a right-wing ideology in the U.S. because they've honestly tried to purposely take that term and to confuse the issue, and they converted Proudhon's idea of property as theft into taxes as theft. That was their way of trying to manipulate it and take it as their own, but it completely misunderstands what was going on. So,
I mean, like for a good like historical fiction-y type reference too, that's a lot lighter. The recent movie, was it? Oh my God, I can't remember. Something about Karl Marx. It was French. Oh my God, why can't I think of it? The Life of Karl Marx. But there's a movie that I'm Googling right now. Young Karl Marx. I don't know why that slipped my mind. But the movie The Young Karl Marx, Proudhon, Bakunin, these people are in there, and you get to kind of see this tension as Marx, creates this revolutionary idea, and then fellow revolutionaries challenge, tweak, and move on, and the relationship that happens there. It's a cool little movie insight into this very specific time in history and this very specific group of philosophers in history. And Raoul Peck did a really good job with it, directing it. So.
Yeah, cool.
Maybe we'll air it on his birthday as a watch together.
That's a good idea. Yeah. So I just kind of wanted to point out that there's this kind of split, I suppose, in the socialist movement between the Marxists and anarchists, and actually goes back kind of a while to the first International Working Men's Association meeting, where the people aligned with Bakunin, and actually Proudhon too, I think, got into a big fight with Marx, and they all yelled at each other about what's the best tactic, and a lot of the anarchists just walked out basically and formed their own, like, well, we're going to make our own international. Unfortunately, there's still kind of splits in the movement, but they do actually largely agree on a lot of things, and it's this discussion around strategies and tactics that is really what separates them, not the motivation and the goals.
This is Hegel.
Oh, there he is. Hey, Hegel.
He's that way because he's big and he's furry and he never shuts up.
Cats. So, that was kind of the earlier forms of socialism, and then Marxism itself kind of splintered into a few things. Like we said, because of the evolution over time, people kind of took different aspects of it and tried different parts of it, and it evolved into different types of Marxism. You had kind of an orthodox Marxism, which was kind of focused on being a political party that represents the working class and getting involved in government. And so you saw, for example, the German Social Democratic Party that arose to try to, create conditions for the working class and socialism through that avenue. You had Bolshevism form in Russia. Lenin, of course, is the biggest name. That kind of took Marxism in that much more centralized party. Revolutionary and insurrectionary sort of direction, right? But But then also in Germany, you had the libertarian, going back to Proudhon, the more libertarian Marxists, such as Rosa Luxemburg, that kind of rejected that more Leninist approach, as well as the central political approach for something a little bit closer to what the anarchists were calling for, although not exactly the same. And then anarchism itself, Proudhon had advocated this type of society that was kind of focused around worker cooperatives trading with each other over a type of market, but not exactly capitalism. And that sort of idea kind of died out and was replaced with anarcho-communism, which Kropotkin is probably the biggest name there. The Conquest of Bread is kind of a fun read. He also wrote The Mutual Aid that we talked about earlier. And there was also syndicalism, which is a very radical form of workers' unions, basically labor unions that are very radically oriented to, there you go, to organize workers and in the workplace toward eventually the workers owning the business itself, right, taking over. So there's stuff to read from all of these different folks if you're interested in these different points of view. But again, these are a lot of different kind of debates over tactics, right, over how to best move in towards socialism.
And one of the things we'll have out relatively soon is a reading list to accompany this. We've dropped a lot of names and stuff like that, and we'll make sure we'll share this spreadsheet, but we'll also get a nice compiled reading list.
So I guess what I forgot with the libertarian Marxism thing is the to kind of give a little bit of a description of what makes them different is one aspect is like council communism, the original Soviets that made up the Russian Revolution. At first there were Soviets that formed, which were these worker assemblies. That's the term. That essentially tried to oppose the Tsar and change it, and that got all kinds of problems, and that was when Lenin came in and all that stuff. So there's a lot of history that goes there. But the point is that you kind of see these aspects of Marxism and anarchism throughout these different things, that everyone kind of tried different tactics. And so because of that, we can learn from their experiences about what worked and what didn't work, what was more successful, what was less successful. Because unfortunately, none of them so far have, defeated capitalism, right? We still live in a capitalist world. So we try to learn our best from these experiments. I did throw Adorno and Horkheimer out there for you.
Yeah, well, and the post-Marxists are super important for this process, right? Mm-hmm. If Marxism started and ended with Marx, we wouldn't be talking about it. Not that he wasn't groundbreaking or anything like that, but 200 years has passed and things evolved, right? During Marx's time, there was a distinct English culture versus German culture, and in Germany there was even distinct regional cultures, right? You weren't just German, you were from Hamburg, or you were from different areas. There was still this kind of uber locality of the world, even though we were first starting to see the rise of capitalism and globalization and all that. Marx, at the stage of capitalism and at the stage of globalization he lived, didn't have the opportunity necessarily to fully see what was about to happen, right? Gramsci, who lived through World War I and into the 30s, he was the first one to, or one of the first to really go, holy shit, guys, capitalism's merging with culture. Right? Like we're losing a distinct Italian culture, a distinct English culture, a distinct German culture, and we're all becoming capitalists. The capitalist culture is we're not all becoming capitalists. Most of us are being oppressed by capitalism, but all of our societies are becoming capitalist in nature, and they're losing that distinctivity, right? And then Adorno and Horkheimer take that to a whole new level with the culture industry, post World War II, and then you get into people like Guy Debord who start talking about, the society of the spectacle and the myth and the bauble that capitalism has sold, right? And that goes all the way back to what we did at the beginning, right? What the board talks about in Society of the Spectacle is why we have to start with what is capitalism, because capitalism is a really good salesman of snake oil. That snake oil is usually itself, right? So even ardent advocates of capitalism, and most ardent advocates of capitalism are not capitalists. They do not own their place of production, right? They are wage slaves like the rest of us, but they are ardent advocates of capitalism based on the myth, based on the lie of the American dream, things like that. So, these post-Marxists, if like I said, if it wasn't for them, and then you get into like Angela Davis starts spinning out on race theory, Julia Kristeva takes Marx and combines him with Freud, right? And you get some really interesting stuff. So it's really it's really important when you get into socialism, Marxism, whatever. Don't just read the old white guys, right? They built the foundation that's continuing to be built into a structure that can hopefully at some point realize socialism, right? So we got to make sure that we don't get bogged down running around the foundation and not running up and seeing what's been going on and having it adapted and applied to our societies. These post-Marxists are in my opinion as valuable as reading Marx and Lenin and people like that. That they are people that are not given enough credit a lot of the time.
Yeah, for sure. There's been a lot of developments, and
so
like I mentioned,
added sexuality in, and Leotard added science and started really coming hard at science. About the pedestal that they were on. So there's just and that's the great thing too, right? That opens up socialism to so many people. Right, I can tell my friend with a biochemistry PhD to read Leotard, and it'll have important value to him in his work. Right, I don't have to send him to read the manifesto, which he's never going to read. I can find him post-Marxists that are right down his alley that he needs to understand in his field.
Yeah, for sure. The original Marxists and anarchists from the 1800s got carried over. A lot of the names here were from kind of the World War eras, and we can learn from what they did during that era in our post-World War II era now, where global neoliberal capitalism is now the thing. So even though it's different, it's not really that different. We still are facing capitalism, and we still are facing a lot of the same challenges. So
Gramsci's famous writings are from prison, smuggled out of prison, and he was an elected person in Italy. Like he was elected and he was doing the party thing where they were going to win socialism, communism. And another random anecdote that I love bringing up. Pete Buttigieg's dad is why we have Gramsci in English. Mayor Pete, that middle-of-the-road milquetoast white guy's dad, was a leftist academic who translated Gramsci's prison notebooks into English. So the apple fell very far from the
I was going to say, it's hard to imagine how it ended up so different. Man. So these are some kind of base influences, but of course there's things in the modern era to look for, which we'll talk a little bit about that in our last few slides here. So that was a lot of the European influence, but I wanted to kind of pivot back to the US here, and how those experiences kind of influenced what was going on in the US. There was kind of a big boom of socialist and communist parties in the U.S. Around that same time period that were kind of motivated by what was going on in Europe, as well as, of course, local conditions, as we talked about earlier with the Gilded Age and how workers were being, very, very systematically oppressed and exploited by, the new growing industries. I live near Pittsburgh, the steel industry and things that existed around here, were a big part of that. One of the most successful, of course, was the Socialist Party. which at its height was actually had thousands of people elected to, especially like local mayorships and city councils, but even to state offices and even a few in Congress. And so it was extremely successful, in its heyday. And so, of course, the capitalist system had to respond to that. It had to evolve and adapt to it, and in order to meet that need, to maintain capitalism, right, against this sort of thing. So again, there's a lot of lessons here to learn. Eugene Debs was the presidential candidate and leader of the party for a very long time, and Howie Hawkins, our Green presidential nominee in 2020, wrote a short book called The Case for an Independent Left Party, which you can read for free online from greensocialist.net, right? I get the website right. And so you can read a little bit more about the background of this, but I have a quote here about the Socialist Party is the only significant left third party in American history that was based on a dues-paying membership organized into local chapters. And that was absolutely necessary for working people if they were to have labor unions and political parties that were controlled, that they themselves controlled, that the workers controlled, and with the resources necessary for effective action. And so that's something that we can learn from it, that part of the reason it became so big was because it had this very worker-oriented structure. You were a dues-paying member, and you participated through the party that way. That's actually a big critique of what's going on today, where the Republican and Democratic parties, they don't have members. They're memberless associations that are really just meant to represent the big donors. If you become a member of the Democratic or Republican Party, it doesn't actually mean anything. They don't really listen to you unless you're a top donor. But when you have this sort of membership, as the Socialist Party did, it actually allows you to organize for the working class.
And I linked that section on the Socialist Party in the comments for everybody.
Oh, cool. Yeah. There you go. So, there's a lot to learn from the Socialist Party organizing during that period where it was really at its height, where thousands of people were elected. And that's, something we should aspire to again.
And it should be noted, it's when we won a lot of important reforms, right? You see memes on social media all the time saying thank a union for this, that, and another thing, but it was thank a socialist, right? 8-hour workday. I just read my 8-month-old son a story today about Mother Jones and her March of the Mill Children, right? Like it was socialists that won child labor protections, that won all workplace safety stuff, all that kind of stuff. So not only were they electing people, but they're passing and getting through very important protections that remain today and that are valued still today.
Yeah, it was a strong combination of getting in the streets with activism, with supporting labor unions, and with getting people elected, and that combination really created a lot of change. And when people have that rose-colored look at American history and I wish it was like that again, most of what they're thinking of was gains by socialists that were fighting, particularly during this era. And so, of course, because of that, there were difficulties. So Debs himself was actually jailed at one point for speaking out against imperialism, for speaking out against war. And he actually ran for president from jail for a while. The Republican and Democratic parties worked to suppress the Socialist Party and make it harder for independent parties to form in the future. And so that's something, of course, we have to look at and think about, that as we're creating a new Green Party for the mass working class, what are those hurdles that we're looking at in order to overcome, right? We also saw that a lot of the radical unions that were fighting at the time, that this is when a lot of the modern police forces were created. For example, the state police in Pennsylvania were created during that time period, and they weren't created because there was like a giant crime spree or whatever. They were literally created to suppress worker strikes. and their tactics were taken directly out of military occupation tactics. So, that's an important part of history for us to understand. When we're talking about issues around policing and stuff, that it partly because of racism and slavery and things, and also partly to suppress socialist and labor unions and things. And then finally, because the Socialist Party was so successful, it had, of course, its own platform and demands and its own vision that it wanted to implement. And capitalism was so threatened by it that FDR essentially stole a lot of those points and watered them down, and said, in order to kind of address the things, but in a way that was going to save capitalism. And that was what became the New Deal. So capitalism was able to co-opt the Socialist Party message, essentially. So I think these are all important things that we should keep in mind as we're organizing. Capitalism. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
This period too is also when you saw lots of unions begin to emulate capitalism and change significantly. World War II was a big, bellwether point for the direction that, or World War I was a big bellwether point for where unions were moving when we were winning these things in the 1800s and the early 1900s. Unions were small and radical organizations, but they kept combining into these larger and larger and larger organizations until you get to the point in World War I where unions became a pretty big player in suppressing anti-war sentiments in the left, because and it's the same kind of stuff you hear now, right? The AFL-CIO always backs to pipelines because that means jobs, right? And this is the same era when you see, the AFL and CIO and things like that start to form. And so you start to get these bureaucratic centralized unions coming up that their mission is no longer to wage war with capital like the original and the successful smaller radical unions were. We'd always talked about systems and things. So this capitalist backlash managed to infect the working class leadership, and really start us down a road of misleadership and things like that.
Yeah, and I think that's especially what kind of the last point on this slide really hits on, that the so-called New Deal coalition, what that really was the Democratic Party co-opting independent political parties as well as those originally very radical labor unions. In our slide earlier, we talked about, a lot of the Marxists wanted these independent worker parties, and those parties were co-opted into the Democratic Party during this era, essentially, because the Democratic Party said, hey, we'll do a little bit of what you want, and maybe if you work with us you'll get a little bit more, and a little bit of a combination of the carrot and the stick, right? That it's hard to go it alone, and maybe if you work with capitalism you'll get some crumbs. And then in addition to that, the labor unions, syndicalists and things like that originally started with very radical viewpoints of taking workplaces for the workers, eventually became co-opted and meshed into the Democratic Party, because again, that was kind of an easier path of resistance. So it seems like they're doing some stuff from workers, and we'll just kind of go that path and see if it works a little bit better. So we saw these radical movements get co-opted into the Democratic Party around this time period, and many of them are still co-opted there. We have a history of
what's still a tried and true tactic for them.
So, yeah, for 80 years now, right? Something like that. For 80 years, a lot of these labor unions and quasi pseudo independent political parties work within the Democratic Party umbrella, and they get co-opted to make the Democratic Party seem a lot more radical and on the side of workers than it actually is. It really is part of the capitalist, again, the infrastructure of capitalism. It's not individuals in the Democratic Party. It's now baked into capitalism itself. So that kind of gets us to the post-World War II point, and this is where you see kind of the beginnings of a green socialism, and in what's called social ecology. So starting around the 1950s is when really a lot of environmental movements after World War II started to come up and really pay attention to the pollution impacts of both industrialism and also militarism, right? Imperialism itself. And at this time period, unfortunately, a lot of socialist groups that, probably coming off of, what had happened in the previous few decades, they were kind of reorganizing, and a lot of them didn't not necessarily even consider environmental things to be an important part of working class struggle. They actually considered it to be like, oh, that's actually like a rich person, a bougie thing, and so it wasn't taken that seriously at first. But environmentalists pointed to things like Chris was talking about, the related environmental struggle to to racism and to sexism and capitalism as a whole. And over time, we developed this bigger picture where environmentalism and ecology are an important part of or have to be an important part of our socialist movement against capitalism. And so one of the big names during time period is Murray Bookchin, who originally in his youth started as various Marxist socialist things, tendencies, became frustrated with those party structures, and then tried to become an anarchist, and then became frustrated with the way they organized, and said, all right, we're going to have to rethink this whole thing. We're going to have to rethink the whole socialist project for the modern era to accomplish our goals, because these old organizing methods are not working in the modern era. We have to rethink what we're doing. So he sought to create a synthesis of these ideas. So you see a lot of the Marxist and anarchist sides of things in green socialism, combined with a better understanding of ecology and how human society relates to nature. And the key point that he made is that all of our environmental problems are really at their heart social problems. That when we talk about ecology and fixing our problems with pollution and even bigger problems like climate change, those are ultimately going to take changes to, again, the infrastructure and how our society is fundamentally formed. It's a social problem. It's not really an environmental problem. So we have to focus on changing those social relationships if we're going to create an ecological society. So, kind of our key elements of social ecology are essentially what we've talked about through this whole thing, that we want to look at the past in order to understand where we came from, how capitalism originally arose. We want to understand what capitalism is. We want to understand how past movements reacted to capitalism and what we can learn from them. We want to understand present. We want to understand how capitalism works today differently than it did in the past, and how we need to organize. And of course, we need to build a vision of the future that is going to, be our compass, be our set of organizing principles. That when we are trying to create socialism, we use that to make sure that we're on the right path, right? And as challenges come up and we decide how we're going to handle those challenges, we can use these principles to help guide how we respond to that, so that we're always improving that socialist society like we talked about before. So that includes things like non-hierarchy. We want to make sure that we're not recreating the hierarchies of capitalism where some people or groups are more important than others. We want to have a direct democracy where everyone can participate in decision making. We want to make sure that it's society based in social justice, which means we're fighting all forms of dehumanization. I like that as a broad term. That could include racism, sexism, transphobia, xenophobia, whatever form you find. We're fighting against all those forms of dehumanization. We want to recognize everyone has human rights and deserves to be taken care of, to have their basic needs met, to be loved, to participate in decisions, all those things. Of course, our society has to be ecological and be sustainable. And then finally, it has to be built with a moral economy in mind that is not a capitalist economy. It's an economy that works for the needs of people. So Those are kind of the basic principles of green socialism, social ecology, and you see kind of a form of these in the key values of the Green Party. You can kind of interpret the key values as related to this stuff here. But this is how Murray Bookchin originally kind of developed it. So any thoughts on that, Chris?
A big one is, I think the left has a problem in recreating capitalist structures when it creates itself, and recreating capitalist organizational structures, right? The left especially in the United States, tends to lead with rhetoric when we should be reading into, or we should be leading with, how we organize ourselves and how we organize our work and things like that. And to me, it always comes back to the saying, words ain't shit, right? You can talk about how socialist you are, but you can still have an extremely authoritarian structure that gets in the way of your organizing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Bookchin lays out a really good kind of framework that we can kind of judge ourselves by. I just saw Vicky said capitalism on steroids turns into fascism. That's exactly what Rudolf Rocker says.
Right.
Except he says it's inevitable. That he says capitalism is fascism. It will always get.
Right.
We'd mentioned Rocker earlier. So since I love it when plain words expressions of socialist theory come out. It makes me think of when I was a community organizer and I was knocking doors and I talked to this young black guy, probably 25, and I was supposed to talk to him for 5 minutes. I talked to him for over an hour. He became one of my best organizers in his neighborhood. But on the top of his little card that I carried around for everyone I talked about, I wrote Foucault and doesn't know it. Because the way this young man talked about power mirrored the way that Foucault talks about power in Knowledge Power, right? But this young man's never read Foucault. He has no idea who this gay French postmodernist is, right? Who's dead at this point. But his experiences were able to allow him to articulate the exact same ideas as someone who spent their entire life theoretically thinking about this stuff, right? And I'm going to go off on a slight tangent here, but I think that's another super important thing that we'll talk about a lot next. We'll talk about it next month as well. But the left overvalues book learning. And that's not that I'm not trying to devalue book learning, right? It's reading these theories, getting exposed to these ideas is important. Understanding the past, present, and future, like this slide says, is important. But we way undervalue experience. And the reality is we don't need to explain the negatives of capitalism to people, right? The working class knows about capitalism. The working class has become alienated, though. The working class is, in many ways, rightfully decided that they're not going to participate in their own destruction anymore.
That relates to the classic socialist concept of praxis, the theory and practice together. People intuitively, because they live it, understand the problems of capitalism, and they understand kind of where we need to go. But it's that experience that we don't necessarily understand what's the best strategy or tactics to take in order to get there. And so where the theory comes in is learning from history and past experience to better inform ourselves so that when we take action today, we're more likely to get the wins and gains that we want.
It's not an either or. They're interconnected. And then when you come into organizing with just theory, that experience is essential to tell you how the theoretical things that exist are manifesting in local circumstances, right? What environmental racism looks different depending on where you live, right? What these things, how these things manifest in our local communities is different. And if you come in with a completely, academic theory-based thing, you're going to be missing, because you're not going to have your finger on the pulse of what's actually happening in communities. So you need both. It's not a lot of things are posed as either ors, as mutually exclusive. And we talked about it last month in the Green Party. Are we an electoral party, or are we a movement party? We're both, and we have to be both.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same goes for the left in the United States in particular has been stuck in its books, and it's kind of forgotten how to go out into the neighborhoods. And that's left us with a very academic, theory-oriented left that is really obsessed with the books of old dead white men, and they just aren't listening and engaging with the people who are, expressing the experiences of oppression that they face under capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
It's a major organizational shift we have to make in the left that I'm sure we'll get into next month.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, that's pretty much the end of this talk here. So,
good segue.
Yeah, it's a good segue to organizing, right? So, the green socialism, or the ideas of Bookchin, as well as all the other socialists and anarchists that we mentioned, and lived experience that came through the civil rights movement, feminist movement, environmentalists, and the peace movement that existed in that post World War II era. All of that came together to form the Green Party. And so I think in many ways, the Green Party is kind of the successor of the Socialist Party that we talked about, or at least, we hope that it organizes to become the successor, right? To be
what we're working towards.
Big one. So we have to have this commitment to independent organizing. That's not just a tactic, but it's actually, an important commitment that the working class has to organize itself and fight for itself. Has to be committed to anti-imperialism, and we need to consider things from the Socialist Party, such as dues-paying membership, in order to help all that. So this all leads into our questions that come up at our next live stream, the Organizing 101. That how do we balance all of these different things? How do we balance the elections with with unions, with activism, and that sort of thing, right? How do we organize as an independent party, even though we know that there's major suppression in the U.S.? How do we balance things like decentralization and centralization? We were talking about Marx versus Anarchist, and they both had good points, and they both have experiences we can learn from. And it's not entirely clear that one is always correct versus the other, right? So there's a lot of organizing challenges here about putting the theory into practice, and then vice versa, right? From our practice, updating our theory to better match what our conditions are, and to teach others how to get involved. So that's kind of our topic for our next stream there. So I hope you're looking forward to that in a month.
I want to jump back one real quick.
Yeah.
And make sure we don't gloss over it. Independent organizing outside of capitalist power structures is absolutely essential. Like, it's not a strategic thing. Do we work with within the Democratic Party of Socialists or not? You're never going to achieve socialism from within a wholly committed capitalist party, right? And you can look at places like France, where they have a socialist party that was neoliberal, right? The word was and there's a long, interesting history about how the French Socialist Party became the Socialist Party, and that it basically is just they stole the name, right? And they did what the Democrats did to the Green New Deal. They took the name and they watered down the content, to quote Howie, but it's really, we have to organize independently, and that means the work is harder, right? Just to inoculate it, we really have to do that. The work is harder, but independence is a key part of it, right? Very seldom will anyone out of the goodness of their heart, or any system out of the virtue of the system, give you the keys to its destruction, right? So if you're working within a mechanism of the capitalist system, which both the Republican and the Democratic parties are, then you're never going to get that end goal, right? You're always, oh, another cat, both got them. The lack of independence, while it makes the work harder, is essential for the work to succeed. So, we've linked it a few times. If people haven't read it, I highly recommend going to greensocialist.net. You can download Howie's ebook, The Case for an Independent Left Party, for free. It's short, right? I think the longest section might be 2 pages. Most of them are 1 page. The whole thing's less than 30 pages. It's a very short pamphlet. It's broken down into very, very digestible pieces, and Howie does a really good job laying out the case for why political independence isn't a strategic issue. It's a foundational part of socialism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
otherwise we're collaborating, right?
Yeah, and that's that's learning from history. That we had mentioned that some of the socialist offshoots had gone the path of creating parties and trying to get involved in parliamentary politics. And what very often happens there is that rather than pulling the system toward the left, those parties have over time just adapted to capitalism, and they've just they got used to making market reforms and things like that instead of creating really systemic reforms that, again, we need to change the whole social infrastructure, not just changing out people or whatever.
Well, and we see it today in modern democratic socialists,
mm-hmm.
right? Which, just like earlier, when I had talked about people try to put all these conditional clauses on the front of capitalism to defend it, socialism by nature is democratic, right? I get the term came to differentiate from the Soviet model and the Chinese model, but socialism is democratic by nature. And when we look at some of the key democratic socialists that have been elected into government, what we see is a rightward shift. What we see is, towing the line at almost every point, losing battle after battle, and essentially becoming collaborationists in the system they claim that they wanted to get rid of. And they have to do it or they'll find themselves out of power, right? So we have to build our power outside of those parties. If we rely on the capitalist parties for our power, then our power is always undermined. It's always very fragile. And so when we get independent power that's based on mass movements, that's based on relationships in our community, it's a kind of power that can't just be brushed away by Nancy Pelosi.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Because then we won't be scared to mobilize against Nancy Pelosi. AOC is never going to mobilize against Nancy Pelosi. She needs Pelosi for her committee seats. She needs Pelosi to have a voice, and so she will always toe the line when the time comes. She might, like Bernie Sanders, she might talk a good game, but when the time comes to act, when the time comes to cast a vote, when the time comes to directly challenge someone or to fade away into the background, they'll always make the same choice, and it's because they've tied their power to a capitalist party that has no interest in seeing itself undone.
Yep, exactly. So lots of things to learn from history in Organizing 101. So it ran a little bit over, so I don't know if we have time for questions.
We should probably wait. We've already gone 2 hours. So we're doing these every month. We've been going the 4th Tuesday of the month. I imagine, unless one of us comes up with a Tuesday conflict, we'll probably continue that at least through June when we get through our next session. But our goal is we're going Green Party socialism, organizing. And that's the way we're moving through these 101 series. They all build on each other. They're all interconnected, as you've heard today. We've talked about the Green Party. We've talked a lot about organizing, because you can't talk about socialism without organizing. If your socialism isn't involved in organizing, it's just academic. It's just on paper. It's not a material thing. And for socialists, materialism is pretty important. So come on back. We're here every month. Next month, at the very beginning of the stream, Scout Trooper had asked a question: how do we make sure the Green Party can survive? The answer is what we're going to talk about next week: organizing. Right? How do we win socialism? How do we grow the Green Party? It's through organizing. Real world organizing. So come on back and see us. You can go to greensocialist.net/101s with an S on the end. There you'll find the video and the slideshow from our Green Party 101 we did next month. I'm going to go downstairs tonight, and by the end of the night, I should have the video and the slideshow from this one up and get the dates changed out so we're ready for the next one. So next month, we're back at Organizing 101 on the 22nd again, because it's February, and we've got a nice common sense month that has 4 weeks and is lunarly matched. We should have a lunar calendar, not this Gregorian nonsense. But we'll be back next month on the 22nd to talk about Organizing 101. We'll be back in April to go back for a Zoom on the Green Party that should be a lot more two-directional, right? These first 3 we're doing live streams. The nature of the medium is that they are one-directional, right? We're talking to you. We can take some questions, but it's really a format made for one-directional, communication. So that in April, May, and June, we'll be back to talk Green Party, socialism, and organizing in a more two-directional discussion format. Thank you very much, everybody. Make sure if you haven't checked out Howie's podcast from Saturday, he had Matthew Ho from North Carolina on. Matthew is running for Senate, U.S. Senate. He's an anti-war activist. You may have known him as someone who came back from, he was a soldier who came back during the protests of the Iraq and Afghanistan war, destroyed his medals, became a pretty big, part of the peace movement. He's definitely one of the National Green candidates to watch in 2022. So go to greensocialist.net/stream if you want to watch on video, /pod if you want to listen to it on a podcast. And make sure you check that out. Tune in every Saturday to hear what Howie's got to say. He takes he takes questions and he can dive really deep into this stuff. And then come back for our 101s, and Garrett and I and the rest of our education working group team, literally today, we're talking about what we've got coming up, and we've got a bunch of good stuff coming up. So thank you, everybody. Have a good night, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.